And so for the next couple hours, we're going to be talking about a joint project with Harvard Law School's Food Law and Policy Clinic and GFN. It's a 4-year-old project that began with conversations in 2018, finding a funder that would be interested, and has advanced today more than 4 years later. And we'll speak about the details of this and the importance of policy to move the mission that we all are dedicated to. I don't need to revisit this issue. You all know it forward and backward. You heard more about it this morning. But just to kind of fill in some of these gaps is that not only is 1.3 billion tons of food lost for human consumption lost in the stream, if a quarter of that was recovered, we could feed all the world's hungry today. Since COVID, through the cost of living crisis that you are all dealing with today, another 350 million people have been added. We have now more than 2.3 billion, rapidly approaching 3 billion on this planet that are food insecure. More than half of those are moderately to severely food insecure, and the problem continues to grow. And this would be really bad and despairing if there was not a model to help make that connection between food that may go lost or wasted, and it could instead feed hungry people. And that's you all. It's the food bank model. It's the model of finding surplus in the system and redirecting it to people in need. It's about food access for those that are economically disadvantaged. It's about having proper food safety policies in place, proper infrastructure in place, and frankly, the energy and will to say we will recover this food and we'll feed more people because it was produced for human consumption. It should go towards human consumption. There is a critical solution. It begins with you all, but there's a major player. Really, there's 3 pillars to this challenge. One is the commercial agri-system, right? So it is the food systems and the actors within that produce the food that we all eat. We had a great lunch this afternoon, for example. That is as you all know, is the harvest, if you will, of a very strong food system here in Mexico. And there are different food systems all across the globe. They're many times linked and similar, regionally, climatically, and otherwise, but they are distinct. And that's kind of the challenge. One are distinct food systems. And the role of the commercial sector, which produces the food. Secondly, a civil society, which you all represent, is those people that help those in more need, those that have lack for economic or other reasons that are vulnerable and need some kind of assistance to make it, to have the basic necessities of life and have the kind of lives that we all want and their dignity demands they should have. And then thirdly is government. And just like there's different food systems by country, each government is sovereign and makes its own decisions. And that complicates the entire process. It's meant then that as each of you deal with how you can secure more food in the recovery process, it has to be adjusted to the specific policy and political context, the cadence of government, how well you are known within your society and your governmental system, and what policies you can put forward that serve the solution that further serves the policy aims of the government. We come to this issue at a time of great attention overall to food loss and waste. As you can see from the timeline, with the SDGs in 2015, zero hunger really does rely on SDG 12.3, which is to reduce food loss and waste. Then we had the Paris Accords, the EU guidelines, which were groundbreaking and dynamic, and Jacques and his team at FBLI should be very proud of the role they played and helped develop that. The first International Day of Food Loss and Waste Awareness. And then coming all the way to COP27 in Egypt, where GFN was represented by our CEO, Lisa Moon, and we announced a major project to help start to manage with data the methane impacts of food recovery and loss. So the time is right in which more and more policymakers, funders, corporations, and other thought leaders in society want to address this problem in a real way that does not also mean reducing production in such a way, as we found from the Ukraine crisis, that when there's not enough food around, many, many millions of people far away from the crisis suffer. So in 2018, we began the very first conversation, had a funder, the Walmart Foundation, that was very interested in bringing together Harvard Law School's Food Law and Policy Clinic and GFN, because of our geographic reach, to help identify what these laws are. It wasn't just Walmart and its various subsidiaries. It was a problem that many food companies, retailers, and farmer groups had explained to us, is that, and to our food banks, to you all, is that sometimes the laws weren't clear, and they differed country to country. They may even have the same law in the book, but how it's applied and implemented would be different. And the idea of this project that began in earnest in 2019 with 15 countries was to identify those specific laws and policies, and then to make recommendations objectively. So working with the academic institution that was well-known, well-respected, and had long experience in the area of food law and policy to help objectively identify which of these laws could be improved, which policies could be maybe tinkered just a little bit with, and then create a global platform for engagement. Do the study and make sure it's available to anyone that has internet access, so that a policymaker in one country who maybe their country's laws were not reviewed could look at another country's laws, and in that cross-border, cross-cultural way, say, that's a good idea that we need to implement here. And I can tell you that after 4 years of this project, that has happened. A number of countries, many of you here in the audience I've spoken with at different times, your policymakers or your government has seen activity or information or research done on another or neighboring country and has gone to the food bank and said, we need to do that too. And then the fourth and most recent iteration is now a deeper dive into technical assistance, which is to how do we align, I can say this because I come out of an experience in public policy that goes back 30 years, is that you can have really great policies. The idea isn't that we don't have good ideas or sound ideas or ideas that have a positive cost-benefit analysis. The problem is we don't align the politics to those policies, right? So it's a dear friend and former board member of GFN and former head of the World Food Program likes to say, if it was easy to solve hunger, it'd be done by now, right? We know hunger can be solved. The problem is aligning the politics within the policy frameworks and the cadence of different governments. Some governments go through processes in which they have a reauthorization process or a budget that they will, the budget wherewithal to go ahead and put more money into these social protection programs that could invariably support the work that you're doing. We now are in this next transition after some 24 countries being involved in the project to now do a deep dive on the technical assistance to help align your work directly to the formation and implementation of the right policy based on what your feedback is to be enacted. And so with that said, I'd like to bring my colleague up. Emily Broadleeb is the director of the Food Law and Policy Clinic at Harvard University's in Cambridge, and she is going to run us through the progress we've made thus far. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. Wait, I need this. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much. I have lots of thank yous. It's sort of going to be my Academy Awards speech, so let me start with those. So I want to first thank Doug and Lisa and everyone at Global Food Banking Network for this amazing partnership that we've had. And I also want to thank my team from the Food Law and Policy Clinic that many of you have met. There are 4 of them here today, Regan, Kira, Heather, and Trevor. So all of this has been very much a team effort between many staff, and now at the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic, which I run, our main work is really supporting partners and clients like all of you and many groups in the US on a range of topics where we're trying to help people better understand the laws and then work towards systems level policy change to make the laws better. We've had many students. In fact, on the Atlas project alone, we've now had about 50 Harvard Law students have gotten to work on this, so we're also training future leaders. So thank you to my team, to GFN, to Walmart Foundation for the support, and especially thank you to the partners. So as you can see here, we've now, over 4 years, worked on the Atlas project in 24 countries. We've worked with 29 food bank organizations. You all have been amazing to work with and really guided us, especially in the beginning when we didn't know what we were looking for at the start. And then across this project, we've gotten to visit 12 of the countries for fact-finding and site visits. And of course, COVID slowed us down. We had to do a lot of the work virtually. I'm so glad that we're able to be back in person. And just in the last few months, we've started doing trips to countries again. So hopefully, those of you we haven't gotten to visit will get to come and continue working closely together. So this is sort of where we are. I want to give a little bit of a snapshot of what we've learned in terms of trends. So I have usually when I present, I go through each of the different areas of law, but I'm going to focus on a few where we've seen now in this 4-year time span the most energy and the most progress, and leave you with ideas about what to think about. So as you heard from Doug, we in this project, we've worked in 24 countries. What we've done in each country is we've published a guide that describes the laws that relate to food donation. We've published recommendations based on interviews and reviewed by you, our food bank partners in those countries, to make sure it aligns with things that you believe would be beneficial. And then we've also put this all into an interactive online atlas. And you can see here just a screenshot of one of the areas, but if you actually go to the Atlas website, you can select by policy area, and different countries will light up in different colors based on whether there's a strong policy in green, a moderate policy in yellow, a limited policy, or no policy on that topic area. So depending on which policy you click on, you'll see different countries are really strong in certain areas, and we want to really recognize those governments, and really, from what we've learned, those of you in this room who have actually gotten those policies across the finish line. And then, weak in other areas, there's a lot of room for progress in every country. I should say, most of all in the US, where we've been doing this work for a long time, there's a lot of room for progress. So what we did when we started out the project, the very first year, we worked in 5 countries, and I'm going to name you because I appreciate you the most of all for working with us when we were still figuring it out. And that was the US, Canada, Mexico, Argentina, and India. So we went in, we interviewed food bank partners, businesses, and government, and we asked, what are the places where law or policy questions are really getting in the way of you having the impact that you hope to have? And we came up with these 7 areas, and we now, in all of the countries, are really looking at all of these areas. Plus, we also will look at, any other area that's really important that comes up besides these. But we now know for 24 countries how they compare on these 7 areas. One is food safety for donation. So that means, do your food safety laws, explain what you're allowed to donate, and make it easy for businesses to know that they're not going to get in trouble if they're donating food, as well as making sure that food is safe for those who are receiving it. The next area is date labeling. So this is, as I think we heard on the last panel, a lot of food is wasted because it's unclear what the date means on the food, or because it's not clear if you can donate food after the date, even though for the large majority of food, the date is meant as an indication of taste and freshness. So what we've looked at is whether countries are making it clear what those dates mean and how they can do better. Liability protection is another. I'll get into that in a little more detail, but companies will say that they're afraid, even if they know they're allowed to donate, that if someone gets sick, even if they took all of their best steps, they thought the food was safe, they followed all the protocols, if someone gets sick and they are involved in a lawsuit, that they might have to pay a lot of money. So we looked at whether there's protection. Tax incentives and barriers. We looked at, this is a really important area, what is the financial benefit, or in some countries, is there actually a financial barrier to donating? So what we've seen in a few countries with the value-added tax is that you actually can be penalized when you donate food instead of throwing it away. So we looked at that. The next category is requirements and penalties for donation. Do we require people to donate or have a penalty for throwing food away? government grants and incentives, which is really important for building infrastructure for food banks. So is there money coming from the government to help facilitate food recovery? And then lastly, does that country have a big kind of overarching food waste law and policy? So I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I wanted you to know about all of them. You can find out more about them on our website. We have lots of resources, but I'm going to talk about 4 of them that we've seen the most growth over the last few years. So this is sort of a graph that shows when we sat down a couple weeks ago and tried to look across these policies where we're seeing the most movement. And you can see here the 2 biggest ones by far are countries enacting some sort of national food loss and waste law or policy, and then countries enacting liability protection. And then we've seen, green means strong policies, yellow means the moderate policies. The other areas, tax incentives, there's been more uptake, food waste deterrence policies. So I'm going to talk about a few of these. So the first one that I want to tell you about is whether the country has enacted sort of an overarching food loss and waste or food donation policy. And you can see here the green means yes, red means they have not enacted one yet. And they're taking a whole different range, but I just want to show you a little timeline. And I know this is crowded. You don't need to remember it all. I'm happy to share the slides. But since 2016, with Peru starting us off, there have been 9 countries in the atlas. So out of the 24 countries we've looked at, 9 of them have enacted a national framework law on food loss and waste or food donation since 2016. That's a lot of progress. There's a really big range in what these look like. I'm going to show you 3 just so you can see what we're including. So in Brazil in 2020, I know our partner Claudia is here representing SESC. Brazil passed a national food donation law. The main focus is really prioritizing and promoting donation and including a liability protection. In the US, we have an interagency strategy. So there's an effort across 3 ministries or agencies in the US that work on food to partner on building a strategy to reduce food loss and waste. And then China in 2020 passed an anti-food waste law that takes an approach of really focusing on restaurants, media, and government canteens, and really kind of having penalties for those who promote food waste and don't think about being more sustainable with food in those settings. So the next area you saw also liability protection, huge amount of growth here. This shows you our kind of all across the atlas countries, what's going on. Green means that there's a really strong policy. That means that there's a policy that exists at the national level, and it protects not only food businesses, but also food bankers and food recovery organizations from liability when they donate food that meets all the safety rules. And the countries that are yellow, it means that they also have protection, and either it's only state by state, or it protects the business but not the food bankers. So here's the timeline here, again, showing you the snowball effect. So we have a couple early ones. The US, 1996, the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Law, which was really the first one in the country. And we have a shout out to give to Doug O'Brien, who was one of the drafters of that law and has the original hanging in his office, which was very inspiring to me as a young scholar of this important law. We had a few early ones, but again here, Peru in 2016. Since 2016, of our 24 Atlas countries, 8 of them have passed liability protection. That's a huge amount of progress in a short amount of time. And that's only in the 24 countries we're looking at. So I don't know, there might be more going on. I'm just looking at of the snapshot globally we have. So I'll give an example here. I love to bring up Argentina, which was our first Atlas fact-finding trip. So they, of all the countries, also have a very special place for me. And in that country, there was an earlier food donation law. It was amended in 2018 to include very strong liability protection for businesses and also for food recovery organizations and food banks. The other thing I love with that law is that it presumes good faith on the part of the business and the nonprofit. As long as food safety laws are followed, it presumes that, of course, if you follow those rules, you are acting in good faith. And we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt in case anyone were to get sick. All right, the next one I mentioned was food safety for donation. So, of course, every country has food safety laws. Our question is, do those laws mention donation? Do they make it clear that donation is allowed? Do they make it clear what rules you need to follow? A really big question mark that comes up in every country, my home country of the US as well as many others is, for example, there's labeling needed on food when you sell that, but does that, if that food doesn't have that label, can you still donate it because it's not a safety label, like the weight of the food or, a claim on it that the food is good for you or something like that. So we've seen there's only a few countries that we think have strong policies, but there are a growing number of countries that are really adding more guidance on this. So you can see again a timeline here. In this case, starting from 2016 with Singapore, which I know is represented here as well. There were guidelines on food donation. There have been 7 countries since 2016 of just the Atlas countries that have added a new law. They added food donation to their national law, or they created new guidance. Like in the US, there was new guidance put out in 2020, which I think is actually really strong. It's only for meat and poultry, sadly. It's not for the whole rest of food, but it's a really great model. And the spotlight here I'll give is India. So this is a picture actually from our team's visit there right before COVID. It was a really special trip. So one thing that was really successful there, and I think India FoodBanking Network and Zomato Feeding India were really behind this effort to get these surplus food regulations enacted, was that there was a question before that about whether food donation was even legal. So businesses were saying, well, how do we know we're allowed to donate? The laws don't mention donation anywhere. And the Food Safety and Standards Authority added a new regulation saying donation is legal. They laid out a framework for how each state should be setting out guidance for the safety for those donations. And then the Food Safety and Standards Authority also created the India Food Sharing Network. So the last area I'm going to talk about is what we're calling food waste deterrence policies. So this is one you can see actually there's only a handful that are green, but a bunch that are yellow. And what we're looking at here are policies that either restrict food, they have a penalty for throwing food away, or they have some sort of requirement for donation. And we're seeing a growing number of these as well. So let me show you what that timeline looks like. So here you can see 2016 as well, France, also 7 countries that we've looked at. So this includes a couple throughout the EU, and then we're seeing real highlights here in the EU and then throughout Latin America, including Peru, Chile, and Ecuador that have put in place some policy that really puts a thumb on the scale against throwing food away and makes it more cost effective and more prioritized to donate safe food. And China on there as well, I mentioned they're particularly focused on restaurants and government canteens. So, all of the policies we've looked at are really important. Some of them are priorities for you, and they are priorities for us too, but I really wanted to take a step back and see where we're seeing momentum, and these are the things I think we're seeing more and more heat up over the past few years. Lastly, I'll give one example here, which is Peru, which I know also we'll be hearing from Daniela in a panel this afternoon. So there was a law enacted in Peru that requires donations from food stores and supermarkets. And it was enacted in, I think, 2016, but the implementing regulations just went into effect in 2022. So that it took, and I think many of you can agree, sometimes you pass this law, it takes a couple years, you need to stay on top of your ministries to actually do the implementing regulations. So Peru is a great example of this kind of policy. So I wanted to share a couple other real quick things, and then I'm going to ask Doug to come back up and we'll tell you about what we think the future will look like, about the impact and the things we're doing. Outside of the research we've done, how are we trying to move things forward in the field? One thing that we've been doing and will continue is writing issue briefs on these specific policies. So for example, if you've been really interested, you heard me talking about liability protection, you want to go back and figure out how you can, what's the best structure for a liability protection law, we have issue briefs on these topics in both English and in Spanish. And we have 2 that are coming soon, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And then we're doing technical assistance directly to countries. So this has been really amazing. It's been exciting. And it's also to the point that Doug mentioned earlier. We've seen it takes a little while to really figure out where countries are, what is the priority, what can move forward. And especially in this landscape, in this age of volatility, it's really hard. Governments might not have a lot of money, so we've been also really thinking about what can governments do that has low or no cost, and we're going to profile that on a panel a little later in the day, that there are things that governments can do that don't require a lot of money. It might be nice after that to build to some of the things that do require money, because financial incentives help everyone make changes, but there are ways to get started. So these are some of the technical assistance we've done. I'm going to tell you really quickly about two of them. One has been work we've done with South Africa, which I think is not represented here, but has been really helped us think about what does it mean to move this forward. So a big project we worked on in South Africa, we met with Food Forward South Africa, and then also with the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa, and we talked about where can you get progress? And they were really interested in the lack of liability protection and the lack of food safety guidance for food donations. So we worked together to conduct a survey of businesses in South Africa. We had 60 businesses respond, and we asked them about these topics so that now Food Forward and CGCSA have real data to go to policymakers and say, here's what businesses are saying. And what we found was that 85% of businesses surveyed said the lack of liability protection is reducing their willingness to donate food. And we also found 75% said the lack of food safety guidance for donations is making it hard for them. And with guidance on the food safety rules they need to follow, they would be more likely to donate. So this is an example of something we can do, but I think it's something you all can do too, getting some information. We just heard about data. This is not large data, it's small data, but getting some of that information that's like, what is the specific context in your country? What's gonna move the needle? What are businesses saying would make it easier for them and increase their willingness? And then we were able to partner with Food Forward to put this in part of their national campaign on Repurpose the Surplus. We did some presentations on it, so they're moving along with trying to actually get more attention on these issues. And we're doing something similar with partners in India. In that case, we're running a survey with Feeding India, India Food Banking Network, and CII, trying to get similar information, focused in that case on date labeling and liability protection. So I'm going to ask Doug to come back up here so he can talk a little about where we think we're going, and then we'll have time to hear whatever questions we can answer from all of you. Perfect. So let me quickly tell you what's next, in the next 2 weeks. So let me say one thing. Last week we published our report on China, our legal guide, our policy recommendations. So if you've been eagerly awaiting that, which I was, it took a long time, ups and downs of COVID, so that has been a huge success. Huge thanks to Regan Plekenpol, who really got that across the finish line. And then in the coming weeks, we're going to be publishing Brazil, Paraguay, and Israel. So those are next to come. And then we have 2 issue briefs that are forthcoming. One is on this topic of food safety for donations. What do we know? What are the best practices? If you're looking to enact a policy, what should you be thinking about? And then one on food waste deterrence policies. Those are underway. They'll be out very soon. I'm going to let Doug kick us off on the next, which is longer term.
Sure. So first, let me just say, can you hear me? I can yell.
Do you want me to?
What should I do? No, are we good? Yeah, okay, there we go. Ooh, goodness gracious. Okay, so as you can all imagine, you get a bunch of lawyers in a room and you can start to hear, a lot of money going out the door, right? So we're very, of course.
Lawyer jokes.
Yeah. So we are, of course, very grateful to the Walmart Foundation, who first kicked off this project, and then at FBLI in London signaled they would like to do it again. And right now we have a third proposal, kind of a transition proposal now, to do a deep dive on the technical assistance. And what that deep dive is really about is not that the policies need to be reformed necessarily, but can we align that policy to a political framework? An election can change everything. COVID can change everything. A cost of living crisis that drives down revenues for governments can change everything. So we want to align this next round, if it's so awarded, if the proposal's pending now, to one, focus on some countries where we believe the opportunity is right to make a change because all these various political and policy frameworks align. We want to ignite through you as our partners, where this affects you. These are your decisions, right? This is not Harvard or GFN saying you need this policy. It's you saying to us, this policy needs to change. It's a barrier to me getting food, right? And what we want to do is drill down to say that this policy could be changed, and we want to work with in-country partners to educate, inform, and empower. And it begins with academic institutions, law schools in the country, your partners, your stakeholders, the consumer goods equivalent, farmer groups, whatever it is to essentially begin to align, if you will, a coalition of stakeholders in the community and can influence government to have the information they need to go forward and get the work implemented, which is ultimately what we want. Having it on a website's great. It's much better when it's implemented. There's also new research frontiers, and that includes new issue briefs. One issue brief that I would encourage all of you to look at are the 2 COVID briefs, because those COVID briefs actually touch on something that runs much, much deeper. And that is, does government actually support the food bank model in their own countries? In the United States, about 1/3 of all food that's moved through the food bank system in the feeding from government sources and subsidies. It's called the Emergency Food Assistance Program. Many countries around the globe in the GFN system have surpluses that the government, for market reasons, pulls out of the market to reduce supply. What do you do with that? Can that be redirected instead for hunger relief? Can they give you funding for infrastructure and logistics? Government can be good and government can be bad. The idea is, how do you best align that to get the support you need from the public sector? Because in many ways, you're advancing public sector policy aims. More work on disaster relief, more work on climate change. The link of this policy, let's say tax policy, a tax incentive that brings more food into donation, which means then that we've reduced GHG impacts from food that would otherwise rot in landfills, right? So, and then also more webinars, and then advancing, if you will, the empirical research that really does link a policy change here to an impact there. So for example, in the United States, with tax incentive laws, tax incentives that were put in place to promote food donation, we were able to, in the early iterations of this, show that if a simple change in law were encountered, more than $1.2 billion in new food donations would occur over 10 years. And that becomes a powerful message to share with policymakers, legislators, and governments to help them essentially align public policy to the mission of the food bank and the aim to reduce hunger and food insecurity.
Can I add just a little? Okay, before we do any questions, is
Oh,
this
you're
on?
good.
Can I still talk? Can you hear me? Okay. So I just want to add on to that a little bit. I think our main goals are really to keep broadening, bringing more partners in. Every country we've been working in has really, I think, benefited and loved learning about what everyone else is doing. So that's a big takeaway that we've gotten from this. And then I think, to Doug's point, as we're doing work in country on implementation and technical assistance, it has been a wild ride because everyone's at a different place with different needs and different goals. And we're really trying to be able to get make that a bigger focus to make sure we have the time to do that. So I think this past grant cycle, we were trying to do short technical assistance in 8 countries, and we realized things took a while. But we really, in some countries, we worked on date labeling, in some countries on liability, in some countries on tax. So I think it's really figuring out how we can be helpful to everyone here. But I will say, in all of this has been really responsive. Every step of the way, we've only put things into the guides and recommendations that the in-country food banks approved every step of the way, and we've only worked on follow-up that has been requested. So you have an opportunity also over the next few hours today and over the next few days to also let us know what else you need, what else you want. We have so much information now that we're trying to figure out the best ways to help you all act upon it, recognizing that not everyone is dorky lawyers that are in the policy weeds. How can we make it easy for you to use?
And in fact, following this session, there is a breakouts by region. And the whole point of this breakout is for you to share in that regional context, but to your own countries and your own experiences, needs, these are the top 2 policies we need done. These are the top 2 policies we'd like you to focus on. So we have just under 10 minutes for Q&A. So we'd like to open up for questions and answers in the remaining time before we do the breakouts. And I'm going to defer to my GFN colleagues how you want to do, just raise your hand then, please. Any questions?
I see one in the back.
Okay, I see, yes, please. If you could just say who you are and.
Yeah, microphone's on his way, I think. Okay. This is good. You all have more time now to think of more questions. I'm a law professor.
Can you hear me?
We'll call
Yeah,
on you.
thanks. Thanks for the presentation, very interesting. So I'm Juan from Emergent Cold. It's a 3PL temperature control company in Latin America operating in 11 countries. I was wondering what kind of organization within the government is normally the one you address to push this legislation and frameworks forward, and to what other stakeholders do you use to support this legislation? Like in our example, from the private sector, how could we support those kind of, and if we can support your data as well, how can we engage? Because most of these policies normally drafted by lawyers tend to be lacking some logistics, some stuff that it's very important in order for the law to actually work, the framework to actually work within the ground. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Well, so I'm really grateful for your first part of the question, which was really about who in government is making these decisions. So I should say, outside of, a big part of my life is really focused on food loss, waste, and donation, but I also work across all kinds of issues in the food system. And one of the challenges with food regulation in general and how it plays out in terms of this topic is that there are so many different ministries that touch food in every single country. And I can tell you, because I've done this research, there's not really a best practice on this. So I think in some cases, that's why we focus on this sort of framework, national food loss and waste policy, because we think it's a way to get people organized. But it's often, in many countries, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Environment in some cases, very rarely the Food Safety Agency. So that's one reason we were really excited in India that I think in a lot of countries, food safety agencies don't think this is their job, and instead they're getting in the way of more donation because they're not making it clear. So those are some of the big ones. Also a ministry of like social welfare, social development, and often the right hand and the left hand aren't communicating, and that makes it really, really tricky. So it means that there's also a lot of opportunity for change if you can get to talk to some of the right players and explain this to them, because I think everyone wants to hear what's going on. No one thinks it's a good thing that we're throwing food away, but it does take work. As your point on who are the other partners to bring to the table, it's actually a question I'm going to ask our panel in the afternoon, so I'm going to let them talk about when they've had these policy successes, who else have they brought together to do that, but you're right, it's a real partnership. I don't know if you want to add anything on to the
No, I think that covers it, but the point though is that the afternoon, the following panel is going to, after the breakouts, we'll talk about low and no cost policies, right? Low and no cost policies can and should be enacted by governments as quickly as possible, but each government will be different. Some will emanate from parliaments or the legislative branch. Some will come from the Prime Minister's office or the executive branch of a government. The trick, I think, is building the coalitions like industry partners like yours, right? Other NGOs, other players in civil society, academia, commercial actors. Those coalitions seem to be most effective in moving the various elements of government necessary to get the policy enacted.
Other questions?
My boss. Yes, boss.
If someone else has a question, that's fine. But I'm curious to hear, Emily and Doug, as we've been doing this and some of these legislation has come in enacted, are we actually seeing changes in the amount of food being donated? Of course, I'm sitting next to Giddy from Leckett too. Because are we having the intended impact on food donation that we are all desiring?
You want me to go first? Okay. I think it's a great question, and part of now, as we're looking forward, what we want to work on more. So I should say, we're academics, but we have a really great skill set, which is I know law and I can compare laws. Once we're starting to figure out what are the data to look at, we really need to partner. I think that's a really important thing, and I think a lot of countries are asking about that too. Anecdotally, I think we know, for example, that a lot of, the liability protection comes up a lot. A lot of businesses will really say that they need that, but I don't know that we have the data yet to show how much it actually is impacting. And I think when we hear maybe from Israel and others later that sometimes it gets enacted and it's really, you don't realize how much you need to really work to create that awareness. But it's where we need to go.
Yeah, and another thing I'd just add to that is that sometimes the direct, causation and correlation are different, right? So we've seen food banks see increased food recovery, food donation. Is it directly caused by the law change? Unsure. Part of the problem with this project has been that it occurred during COVID. And as you all have seen in your own operations, is that there were enormous spikes both in need from your communities, but also an enormous amount of food that flowed through the systems. So I think in a more normative time, we'll have a better sense as to how much it is causation. But at least in some context, the economics indicates, for example, tax changes may double the amount of food that could move, right? Will it differ country by country in the type of tax regime they have? Yes, of course it will. Liability protections, again, they will differ country by country. But again, when businesses are aware that they can donate with limited risk, then they're more likely to donate, and that should be shown than in more food donated and recovered.
And on that point too, I think one thing I'm really interested in is analyzing how one country's law differs from another and how that might impact. And we're doing that right now. We're modeling this at the state level in the U.S. with partners at this organization MITRE, which is a research organization, where we're comparing on certain policies across 50 states, how do they impact how much food waste and how much food donation. So hopefully we can do something like that at the global level too.
Giddy, please.
So, so first of all, I want to commend you and GFN for coming together and doing all this work, and Emily, your leadership in this. And it was very interesting to do it in Israel. It still is. We're waiting for the last report. But you're creating a great template of the law and the surrounding and the outer layer of the law itself in supporting these initiatives. But I wonder if it will really stand in court. Because as far as I know, there was no case until now, especially or specifically in the US, that it was never tried in court. So if it comes to that, are you sure that it'll work?
It's a really good question. So to give more color, so Giddy's question was, and this has been a challenge in the US. So US, as I mentioned, with Doug's leadership, was the first country to ever pass a national liability protection law. I will say, actually, it was just updated in January, which was really exciting. I'm making some small changes. But as Giddy said, there was never any court case that's brought it to court. So on one hand, you can say, and many businesses do, well, how do we know what a judge would say? And I can understand that. On the flip side, I think what we often say is, it's very highly unlikely that there's going to be a court case about a routine donation of food that followed food safety protocols. And so I think the protection is really meant to show that there's really, from the national level, this interest in making sure food is donated. I think a court would see it that way. I'm not that worried about it. But I would say this has been the challenge, is that there's not a lot of guidance about what they would say. And I don't know that applies to other countries. The US legal system is like uniquely litigious. So, take that. I don't know how you're translating that in the back, but we like to sue people in the US, and I don't think that's necessarily true everywhere else. So it's a nice thing to have the protection. It creates more confidence that this is legal and that it's prioritized, but it may not be necessary.
Yeah, and we're 16 seconds over, so I just want to add one last thing. The challenge in liability protection is there's competing interests, right? One interest is to make sure that people have access to the courts for redress of a wrong done to them, like getting sick from donated food. The other competing interest, though, is to encourage food recovery. And I can say, knowing most of you in this room, or having met you over the 5 years I've been at GFN, is that you're deeply committed to feeding hungry people with good, wholesome, safe, nutritious food, right? So those two competing interests have to be worked out in each country's context based on both their legal system and their political system and their willingness to at some level say, we want to encourage food recovery without also denying people the right access to redress in the courts. So that's the challenge. We are now a minute over, and I don't want to have really mess up the schedule. But so you are all going to leave, or you're invited to leave here to go to breakout sessions where we're going to ask you to speak about the priorities that you see in your food bank's context, in your country, shared within a regional context. The breakout sessions will be in the LATAM group, will be here in this room. The Asia and Africa regions will meet in the room closest to us. I think you go out and you'll be guided that way. And then US, Canada, and the European Union will meet in the room one over from that. So if you would just follow, yes, Juan Carlos. I'm sorry, yes.
Más que una pregunta, voy a proponer un reto. Gracias, Emily.
Un segundo, por favor, para que traduzcamos. Un segundo, por favor. Segundo, por favor, si puede esperar. Thank you for your work. The Atlas has been very useful, has allowed us to see what's going on in the world. And the Atlas has allowed us to propose modifications, amendments in Colombia. In Colombia, we have tax benefits for food donation, but food banks in Colombia, just like other food banks in the world, we also rescue articles, non-food, cleaning products, cosmetics, toys, school supplies, etc. In fact, that helps us to finance the operation, to subsidize the operation and get more food. But we have found the bottleneck because the donation of non-food products, of course, they don't have any tax benefits. So companies in Colombia would rather throw out or destroy products because if they donate them, they have to pay tax. So what I want to propose is what other areas, maybe in the future we can have an atlas of donation of non-food items, because there's not so much information about how much retailers destroy, how much the industry wastes and destroys, and how can we get information so that we can propose in our countries that those products are not dumped and can also be donated to prevent contamination, pollution, to improve the quality of life of the most vulnerable people.
Thank you so much for the question. You know, I think this is a really good point, and I should say we don't talk about it enough, but the U.S. Liability Protection also covers grocery items that are not food. And I know this has come up, actually, I mentioned some of the work in South Africa. This has come up as an important thing to include in there. So I think at the very least, talking about, you know, where liability protection applies to non-food items, I think you're right. And we've seen even during COVID times more, you know, models of like mutual aid and donation that include food and other items. I know in the US there was actually been a lot of discussion as well about even things like pet food and things like that, which have come up a lot. So just, it's partly, you know, everything we're talking about. How can we be more sustainable, have a more circular economy when food or other items are created? And then how can we be really thinking about those that are in need? I'll say one other thing just.
We need to wrap it up.
Can I say one sentence?
Yes, you may.
Which is, I think the most important thing to say, what are learning of all of this is, number one, there are ways we can very easily make sure law is not a barrier to the donation, and that's really a big focus. And then number two, how can we start to change the incentives to align them to make this the easy thing and the financially incentivized things to do. So that's really my hope and my goal with all of this. And I'm excited for the breakouts. Did you finish telling everyone what rooms?
I did, but I'll say it again. So again, Latin America, stay here, please. Again, robust conversations about these policy changes. Africa, Asia, the Middle East, it's the first door as you come out, you'll be guided. And then for Canada, the United States, and the EU, it's the room adjoining, sorry. So again, thank you all so much for your attentiveness. Look forward to having more conversations this afternoon. Thank you all.